This presentation was delivered at the Center for Advanced Signal and Image Sciences 28th Annual Workshop. The authors are Igor Brovikov and Karine Levanyan. Igor Brovikov presented the talk at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California on June 5, 2024.
The subject of this talk is towards optimal training distribution for photo-to-face parametric models in video games. It's quite a bit of mouthful, but the main idea of what we propose is on the diagram on the right on this slide. The idea is to manipulate distribution for training data in such a way that we get uniform sampling that contains a proper amount of samples, not too many, not too few, and they're distributed in the best way possible. And we will explain next what we mean by that. Also, we will introduce the context for this work and we'll move to technical part. So we start with explaining what pseudo-random heads. They are generated for parametric models. An example of such model is Flame, used widely in academia. We will talk about photo-to-face parameters problem, and then we will go to explaining how we use latent space and authoring spaces to approach our problem. Optimality of distribution, we will explain that and revisit our pseudo-random heads. We will finish with future work and conclusion. This short video shows sort of natural or common head shapes. We can control their variety and achieve pretty good dissimilarity between different heads. And we can generate quite a few of them. As you can see, the features of these head shapes sort of correlated. Nothing falls out or sticks out as an outlier. That's what we mean by believable or natural. These are parametric heads, and the idea of parametric modeling of heads can be illustrated with a Flame web-based editor. It uses a whole bunch of parameters to tweak the appearance of nose, mouth, make it longer, shorter, move it up, down, etc. It drives either blend shapes or animation skeleton, through which it can apply all these deformations to the base shape. For Flame, we have about 100 parameters for the neutral head shape, and some parameters control facial expressions. We are not going to discuss facial expressions in this presentation, but it's good to have them in mind for the future work. So parametric models are common in video games. Because there are that many parameters, it may be pretty hard to manipulate them all to fit the appearance of a particular head to match the reference image. So if we have reference images, we would like to run a neural net and do monocular reconstruction, which takes in the image and fits parameters from this single photo to reproduce the likeness. That can be useful in art pipeline and potentially as a player-facing feature. Training a large DNN for that kind of problem takes time and lots of training data. Where do we get the data is a big question. One source is scanned heads. This is an expensive process, and also handcrafting heads is pretty much equally expensive. So we cannot count on both scanning or handcrafting as a reliable source of lots and lots of training heads. Because of that, training data is synthetic and generated with authoring tools via automation. The tool can randomize parameters, generate the image, and save these pairs as a training data. Here is an example of what kind of training data we may have in mind. Top row shows Flame heads with parameters driven to pretty much to the extremes and even above intended values. You can see that the underlying geometry may start breaking, but what is also important, the features become less natural and less correlated. A similar effect you can observe with our in-house tool, where we generated in a similar way some number of random heads. So these heads are useful in a way, but they would not deliver proper correlations for the model training. Here is what we mean. Natural faces in the wild are located in this smaller domain, and there is domain gap between natural faces and random synthetic faces. we can generate way more synthetic faces than we can find in the wild. At the same time, the modeling tool may not be as powerful as we want, and some faces can be left out. Our goal is to make these two circles as close as possible, meaning synthetic faces generation should follow faces in the wild as closely as possible. That should guarantee that we avoid spurious correlations and capture the natural ones. It also ensures that we provide pretty good coverage of natural faces in the wild. To push it even another step forward, we want to sample those natural faces in an optimal manner. We want to spread samples uniformly, and that will reduce the amount of required training data, just because we will have good coverage with sparse yet dense enough samples. How do we achieve that? We can use autoencoders like FaceNet. FaceNet is trained to reproduce input face as closely as possible by first encoding into a latent vector. The latent space is that rectangle in the middle, which is a bottleneck where actually compression of data happens, meaning input face is represented by a relatively small number of values and then can be reproduced from them with good accuracy. So latent space is essentially a compressed representation of facial features. Another useful property of latent space is that we can measure distance between different faces, and that distance tells us about how similar are they. The distance usually is cosine distance, and the value below 0.51 can tell us that faces are very similar or maybe belong to the same person. And because the volume or capacity of that latent space is finite, because it's a 512-dimensional unit sphere, we can estimate that there could be only 10,000 substantially different human faces. And that gives us an idea of how many samples we may aim for when we generate training data. Now, how can we use latent vectors for achieving this task? We have authoring parameters, which are values for the sliders that control face. And on the right, we have that latent space with potential placement of samples. The first thing that comes to mind is to train forward mapping that takes authoring parameters and maps them to latent vector. That can be done in a straightforward manner. When we randomize in authoring space, we can also render an image, send it to FaceNet, and we will obtain a latent vector. We mentioned that randomization in authoring space is not necessarily that useful. So when we have pairs of authoring parameters and latent vectors, we should consider backward mapping when from latent vector we try to reproduce authoring parameters. And that can provide the tool for solving our problem. Meaning, if we sample uniformly in the latent space and then map through backward mapping to authoring space, we will introduce structure for the authoring parameters. At the same time, we will not generate extra samples beyond what we want. There are ways to populate latent space with such uniform, sparse samples. That is not the subject of this talk, and even naive algorithms can give reasonable results in reasonable time. The faces we showed in the beginning were generated in exactly the same way. Be randomized in latent space, mapped to authoring parameters, and rendered in grayscale. Top row is Flame, bottom row is an in-house tool. Just because we render it in grayscale, that reduces the variety of faces that we generate. We started with pretty big separation of samples in latent space, which is top row. The input distribution was localized around 1.0 for pairwise distances. And when we rendered faces generated from that, we got substantially smaller separation. One reason is grayscale. The other possible factors are absence of hair and facial hair. Nevertheless, we can ask a question. If start in latent space with a sample L converted to authoring parameters and then recover new sample L dash from those authoring parameters by rendering and computing embeddings, we will find some distance between sample L and L dash. What if we can learn a rotation that brings sample L' into location of sample L? Then we can compensate for loss of dissimilarity when we map from latent to authoring space. This is one of the items of our future work. Here are some more items for our future work. We want to include color palette elements, facial expression, hairstyle, facial hair, etc. The expectation is that the distribution shift will reduce, and also we want to get better understanding of the latent space structure. For example, we can change color palette elements and see in what dimensions the latent vectors move. We can also ask a question about completeness of authoring space. How large are gaps in the latent space that we cannot populate with authoring tool? And also we can rank authoring parameters by influence on visual variety to reduce number of sliders, for example, when we work on mobile application. Of course, FaceNet is only one of the networks that compute a latent representation of human faces, so there is room for more experimentation in that direction. And latent spaces are pretty common and used in generative domains, so we can extend our research to new areas. Before concluding the talk, we can also mention that our approach to generating samples can provide us with fictitious characters for games. We can generate plenty of those and provide infinite quote-unquote population for virtual worlds. Now let's conclude the talk. We utilize latent space to introduce natural correlations to authoring parameters when sampling. Photo-to-face models trained on samples obtained in such a way will preserve such correlations, and we can optimize their number. Thank you for attending.
For more information, please visit our website at seed.ea.com.